And today we are talking about examples of earnings sharing mechanisms in state utility commissions. The Performance-Based Regulation Working Group thanks the U.S. Department of Energy for its ongoing support. And so today we have 3 examples for you, one from Hawaii, one from Nevada, and one from Vermont. So we're going to get straight into that. So an earnings sharing mechanism is a popular form of hybrid regulation. With earnings sharing, the regulator allows the operator to keep some portion of its earnings that it receives from the market and requires the operator to give the rest to customers, perhaps through price reductions, refunds, or increased investment. And thanks to our friends at PERC for that definition. Reading through a paper that was submitted to the British Columbia Utility Commission by Pacific Economics Group, I pulled this list of different considerations and differentiations between how states have approached earnings sharing mechanisms. Sometimes they are part of another tool. Regulators do need to consider at what level it impacts the utility's incentive to control costs. There's variations between states on what the deadband level is and what the authorized earning is to begin with, and if that's symmetrical or asymmetric. There's also some decisions to be made, as the definition says, of how it gets reimbursed to the customers. And then there's also conversation about what earnings are eligible to be shared with customers. So thank you to the PSC of Wisconsin for this quick example of how a earnings sharing mechanism works with an example from December 2019. So for the first 25 basis points above ROE, there is no sharing with the customers. Between 25 and 75 basis points, 50% is shared with customers, and then after 75%, 100% are shared with customers. So now these are just some other references that I used to prepare for today, so I thought that they might be helpful to you all. So now we're going to turn it over to Daniel Park of the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. He will be giving a talk on their approach. Daniel, are you there? Hey, Dan, looks like we got you.
Oh, hi. Yes, hi. Sorry about that. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Carrie. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity today to just sort of share with everybody here in today's working group about Hawaii's experience with an ESM. So for today, I was hoping to cover some information about the existing ESM that we have here. So I'll provide you with some of the background as to how this ESM came about. I also have some historical data about the performance or how the ESM has actually sort of functioned over the years since the ESM has gone into effect, and also provide you with an illustrative example of how the ESM actually functions, like with respect to, say, like the tariff sheets and whatnot. And finally, I'm going to end today by just sort of talking briefly about some of the proposed changes to the ESM that are currently under discussion in the Commission's open PBR investigation. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so some background about the ESM here. So the ESM was established back in 2010 as part of a comprehensive package that was primarily aimed at implementing decoupling for electric investor-owned utilities here in Hawaii. And the 2 primary items that came out of that are the RBA and the RAM, so the revenue balancing account and the rate adjustment mechanism. And the RBA is the actual decoupling mechanism itself. So it's the account that the utilities are allowed to record their regulatory assets or liabilities with respect to the under or over collection of revenues relative to a target revenue. And the RAM there is just the attrition relief mechanism for the utilities in the interim years between rate cases. Now, the RAM in particular was a source of a lot of controversy, and many of the parties and participants in the investigation at the time had raised concerns about it, and it potentially resulting in overcollection for the utilities. So as a result of that, the commission adopted a number of customer protections as well. And these included the ESM, so some earning sharing for earnings that were in excess of the authorized ROE, and a number of others, which included this major project cost allowance or cost overrun disallowance, and a triennial rate case, so rate case cycle. So the commission and the consumer advocate could periodically review the decoupling mechanism and the RAM to make sure that it's functioning appropriately. Now, the reason why this package sort of came about was because back in 2008, the state started really pushing these policy goals with respect to adopting more renewable energy, as well as energy efficiency programs. And it was sort of viewed at the time that having a decoupling mechanism would help the electric utilities go about realizing those policy goals. So that's why we've got this whole package, which included the ESM. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so the ESM itself, this is how it actually looks. So it's an asymmetrical ESM. So there's no sharing on the downside, it's only on the upside. So at or below authorized sharing, or the authorized ROE, no sharing. For the first 100 basis points above the authorized ROE, it's 25% sharing to the customers. The next 200 basis points, it would be 50% sharing. And finally, anything above 300 basis points is 90% sharing back to the customers. Now, the actual amount of the sharings is determined on an annual basis. So every year, as a result of the decoupling mechanism that was put into place, the electric utilities file annual decoupling transmittals. And within these transmittals, there is a smaller schedule there that's specific to any potential earnings that the utility may have earned in excess of the authorized ROE. And that amount of sharing is subsumed into this larger RBA adjustment. And when I show you the illustrative example of the earnings sharing mechanism, you'll see what I mean when I say that this amount of sharing gets subsumed into this larger adjustment. And this adjustment itself goes into effect in June of the following calendar year. So, for example, if there had been any earnings that needed to be shared in 2019, the utility would not actually start paying customers that earning back until June of 2020. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so this is just some historical data about how the ESM has functioned over the years. So there are 3 electric utilities, or investor-owned electric utilities here in Hawaii. They're all sister companies. This one, Hawaiian Electric Company, or HECO, is the one that services the island of Oahu. And in the blue there, you've got the rate-making ROE, and in orange, you have the actual book ROE for HECO. And the gray line above that is the authorized ROE. And as you can see, HECO, despite some of the concerns that were being raised that the utility could potentially over-earn as a result of the decoupling mechanism and the attrition relief mechanism, as you can see, HECO has actually been, for the most part, under-earning its authorized ROE and has actually only triggered the ROE once back in 2012. All right, so next slide. So this is the same information except for MECO, which is the utility that covers the island of Maui, Lanai, and Molokai. And just like HECO, MECO also, for the most part, has been under-earning its authorized ROE and has only triggered the ESM twice, so back in 2013 and 2014. And finally, if you can move on to the next slide. This is Hawaii Electric Light Company, which services the island of Hawaii, or the Big Island. And just like the others, it also has always been sort of under earning relative to its authorized ROE, and has only triggered the ESM once, which is in that first year back in 2011. So despite those concerns that many of the parties had raised back in 2008 to 2010, during the period in which the decoupling mechanism and the RAM were being considered for by the commission. In practice, it turns out that despite having the RBA and the RAM, all three companies, for the most part, seem to have some difficulty with achieving their authorized ROEs. And because of that, we haven't actually had too many examples of the ESM being triggered here in Hawaii. But we do have a few, and I did want to show you the results of one of those years. So if you go to the next slide, you can see how the ESM sort of, like, when it's been triggered, how we've been dealing with it. So in the filing here, you can see I've got an arrow here for the amount of earnings that need to be returned to customers. So it's a pretty straightforward calculation. You just calculate the actual ROE, subtract out the authorized, and then from there determine how many basis points need to be returned to customers, and then just translate that into a dollar amount. Next slide, please. All right, so, and then earlier I mentioned that this amount gets subsumed into the larger rate adjustment, or the RBA adjustment. So if you look at the bottom there, line 12, you see the 1.32 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is the actual amount that shows up on customer bills as this one line item, this RBA rate adjustment. And as you can see in the lines above that, it is composed of multiple items. So that includes at the top the RBA amounts, in the middle there the RAM amounts, and then where I've got that arrow in the middle there, that's the earnings that are being subtracted out of any amounts that the company is supposed to collect via the RBA or the RAM. All right, so next slide, please. And this is kind of hard to see, but this is the actual tariff sheet there. So if you see at the very bottom, the tariff sheet, on an annual basis, it just gets modified to reflect the appropriate RBA adjustment. And for this particular year, so this is for 2012, that amount got adjusted to that 1.32 cents per kilowatt hour. All right, so next slide, please. So that was basically the ESM as it is now. And currently the commission does have a PBR investigation ongoing. So back in 2018, the legislature passed and the governor enacted Act 5, which basically directed the commission to de-link utility revenue, electric utility revenues from investment amounts. And coincidentally, around the same time, that's when the PUC had also opened its PBR investigation. And as part of this proceeding, the ESM, like changes to the ESM, have been discussed, and the primary change has been to make it both upside and downside with respect to earnings, and with the idea that this would sort of serve as guardrails to any sort of new regulatory framework. All right, so next slide, please. And for the most part, the parties are supportive of this idea. And the only difference here has been sort of how large any potential deadband for the CSM would be, and what the actual sharing percentages would be for different tiers of earnings. But one party, Blue Planet Foundation, which is an environmental advocacy organization, does oppose the use of an ESM here, largely for because it does dilute cost control incentives during a multi-year rate plan, and it doesn't necessarily break that direct link between rates and investment levels. So while they do oppose the ESM, they have suggested as an alternative to, if the commission was to implement an ESM, to center the ESM around a beta rather than an ROE. All right, so that's all I have today. So I'll turn it back over to Carrie.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Dan. And we are going to turn to Kim Lightheart in just a moment. So, okay, you're up. I also just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that we have our the slide deck in the handouts portion of the GoToWebinar control panel that you see. Also, if you send in your questions now, you'll be first in line for once we open up Q&A. So we'll look for you there. And Kim, thanks for being on. And oh, by the way, she is a licensed CPA, and she's worked at the PUCN for 13 years. And she's also worked at the Nevada Gaming Control Board. So I thought that was really fun and interesting too. So thanks, Kim, for being here, and take it away.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay, you can probably just go to the next one. I wasn't quite sure what kind of slides we were doing. With respect to earnings sharing mechanisms, we're very new to it here in Nevada. It has first been applied to Nevada Power Company, which is our Southern Nevada Electric IOU. It is the largest utility in Nevada. It was put into effect on January 1st of 2018. It's asymmetrical, and the utility's authorized ROE is 9.4%, and up to the 9.7%, all of the earnings are retained by Nevada Power. In excess of the 9.7%, the earnings are split 50-50 with ratepayers, and there is no cap. Effective January 1st of 2020, basically the same earnings sharing mechanism was put in place for the sister company, which up north, which is Sierra Pacific Power Company, with the exception that the ROE was stipulated at 9.5%. You can go ahead and next slide, please. So we came to this earnings sharing a bit from what I would call a non-traditional or there wasn't really a rulemaking, there wasn't legislation. How did we find ourselves here? We had a statutory GRC, general rate case, that was required to be filed by Nevada Power. In Nevada, we have a historical test year, which was 2016. Certification was through May of 2017. And we have what we call an expected change in circumstance, which has allowed certain adjustments beyond that certification period that would go through December 31st of 2017. We have, from the date that is filed, statutorily a 210-day time period by which the order needs to be issued. You all know how much fun those are. The order needed to be issued by January 1st of 2018, and it's a 3-year rate effective period, so that would begin January 1 of 2018 through December 31st of 2020. And the key date that you probably want to remember there is January 1st of 2018. Okay. Can we go to the next slide? So the questions that came up were because in other filings that came before the Commission and were public, it appeared that Nevada Power had earned in excess of its authorized ROE for all 3 of the prior rate effective periods, 2014, 2015, and 2016. And it wasn't necessarily by a little bit. It ranged between 1.9% in excess to 2.07% in excess of what was reported. I do have the little bullet about, or did they, because as you can imagine, during the course of the general rate case, there was some debate about whether those reports were accurately capturing the results and whether or not they had, to the extent, actually earned in excess of their authorized ROE. To add to this, we had what was in this. Nevada Power had in excess of $1.3 billion in debt that was going to be maturing in May 2018, August of 2018, and September of 2019. Keeping in mind that our rates and everything all tidies up on January 1 of 2018. So these refinancings were going to occur just outside of what we were able to deal with within the rate case mostly in the first year to the first 18 months of the rate effective period. The interest rates on that debt at that point in time range from 6.5% to 7.13%. And they comprise more than half the utility outstanding debt in the cost of capital. I believe in the transcript, the CFO of the company represented that current debt rates were 3.1%. Could we go to the next slide, please? And there's a bunch of dates on here that all I wanted to do was kind of give you all a feel for. This was a very large utility with a fully litigated case that we began hearings in late October, or in October. We finished in the beginning of December. We needed to have the order out by January 1st of 2018. And in the midst of all of this, at the very end, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act also was signed into law on December 22nd, which also happens to be the date that our draft order was published. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act impact actually ended up being addressed on a different set of dockets, and those are still being litigated. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what are we going to do? Well, we had a lot of folks with a lot of ideas. We could adjust the ROE. We could say that, that there's going to be this debt refinancing. Depending on what person you were listening to, it could amount anywhere between $10 million and $70 million worth of interest expense that would not be being incurred. We could adjust the cost of debt. I believe that the cost of debt that was being requested was about 6.66%. I'm not going to take anything into that number. Some folks recommended that it be set the same as the sister company, which was substantially less, or that there was an industry average of, I believe, like a 4.27%. Some folks wanted to establish a regulatory liability for the debt, for the difference between what the refinancing was. Some folks suggested filing an out-of-cycle GRC, establishing an automatic mechanism to automatically reduce rates, and one witness suggested establishing an earnings sharing mechanism. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we ended up, the commission ended up selecting an earnings sharing mechanism. And there are a couple of reasons that I wanted to outline for that. Some of it is it provided balance, because of course if someone is going to talk about you're establishing a regulatory liability, what about those other costs that come up should they not have a regulatory asset? There's other sides that provided an ability to balance what was going to be going on for the utility and for the ratepayers. It provided a certain amount of certainty, because even as we were talking, you didn't really know what the company was going to be able to refinance their debt at. It was just probably likely going to be less. And although I hesitate on the last bullet, because I know that there was a lot of folk and working on the earnings sharing mechanism and getting it to where it is today for us, took a lot of the sausage making behind the scenes. I think that even with that, there would still be agreement that there was less regulatory administrative overhead than if we had the Commission had ordered that there be some out-of-cycle rate case to be filed by Nevada Power, or that we somehow create some automatic mechanism that would change rates based on whatever was going to happen in the future. Can we go to the next slide, please? So it first came in, the actual order for the Commission order ordered the company to work with staff and the regulatory operations staff and the Bureau of Consumer Protections, which is our consumer advocate, and see if they could agree on the calculations for over-earnings and to file something in the next, there was a next annual filing. We have an annual filing that has a lot of rate setting in it that comes in annually, and to file in that. And that would be where we would determine what the amounts, the calculation, and how to approach and what to do with the actual regulatory liability. In 2018, that resulted in approximately $43 million, and in 2019 it was approximately $16 million. The parties stipulated in the 2019 annual filing, they agreed on an over-earnings calculation, they agreed on the earnings sharing mechanism calculation methodology, and they agreed to record the shared earnings and a regulatory liability for the next GRC. We are currently in the midst of another Nevada Power rate case, because they're every 3 years, at least at the moment, and there's approximately $60 million regulatory liability, but there's been a proposal to make that a one-time bill credit, considering the economics that we're all living with today. Stay tuned. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So where are we going from here? Well, in 2019, Nevada Governor Sisolak signed Senate Bill 300, which requires the PUCN to adopt regulations governing the filing of an application for the establishment of an alternative rate-making plan by an electric utility. So I guess we're, a couple of years or so behind Hawaii. The earnings sharing mechanism is specifically called out in Senate Bill 300, and we have a PUCN docket that's opened. It's 19-06008, and it's currently in the investigation and rulemaking process. Commissioner Manthe is the presiding officer, and we have issued some concept papers, and we're still working on our goals and all those wonderful good things that you all are used to as well. So I think that is probably it. There's some references there for the actual example dockets. There's some more of the nuts and bolts of how the calculations were done there. And back to you, Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. That was excellent. Thanks for walking us through that whole process. Joan, are you on?
I am on. Is everyone can see and hear okay?
Yeah, you're coming in great. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and a real privilege to get to talk to this group. I really I think it's a dire sign when you enjoy learning about alternative regulation, but I certainly do. So Carrie, I've really appreciated all the work you put into the group. So I wanted to just take a minute to introduce Vermont. It's a very small, very rural state. We have one main utility, but then we also have a slew of municipal and co-op utilities. And we have a natural gas utility and an efficiency utility. I like to say that we're leading in obscurity because we're very small, but we're very ahead of the curve in certain ways, which means that we've developed a lot of best management practices over the years that we hope to share with other states. And I had to point out a few of our accomplishments. So the first is that, we have got one of the lowest carbon electric mixes in the country, and we're moving in the direction of electrifying our transportation sector and our heating sector as well. We have about 94% saturation rate for alternative advanced metering infrastructure. We've got a really great smart grid developed up here. We're still kind of working at the sort of sub-transmission level on some of that. And another interesting thing about Vermont that folks might not know is that we have had performance-based regulation since about 2000, specifically directed at our energy efficiency utility, Efficiency Vermont. So we have a completely separate utility that handles energy efficiency. And part of the way that they earn profits, they're a not-for-profit company, but they do earn extra money beyond what they spend, is using performance indicators. So we have quite a bit of experience doing that. And we also have had alternative regulation or alternative rate making in place since about 2006, I believe. It might be 2005 for most of our major utilities. So Green Mountain Power is our big electric, and Vermont Gas is our large gas utility. And both of those plans have included an earnings sharing mechanism. And for both companies, it's returned money to ratepayers in most years. So it's structured a little bit differently than the other two earnings sharing mechanisms we've talked about. So maybe I'll get into some of the nuts and bolts. If you want to go to the next slide, that would be great. So the nuts and bolts of our earnings sharing, and we've had a few different plans over the years, so things have changed, but currently for our largest electric utility, it sort of functions as an overall governor on company earnings. And I think that that was an important get in for our consumer advocates, because there's some concern about overinvestment or over-earning by the company. The reason it was attractive, so this kind of came into being as part of a negotiated multi-year rate trajectory in which most aspects of rates are adjusted formulaically annually over the summer to go into effect in the fall. And the whole package got negotiated, so there were gives and takes in different places. But I think that the earnings sharing has something to offer for each of the parties. For one, it reduces risks of under-earning for the company. And I think one of the main gets there was, at least for the commission, was the desire to maybe boost the credit rating of some of our companies. So we have seen the credit ratings go up and the cost of debt go down as a result of the earnings sharing mechanism. And from the consumer point of view, it also reduces the risk of over earnings. So for example, Kim talked about the tax cut that happened in 2017. The alternative regulation plan that was in place at that time required that any unexpected revenue generated through tax cuts or unexpected savings in tax cuts be passed along to ratepayers. So I think from the consumer advocate's point of view, that was a win. Another reason it really works for us is that it really reduces the financial incentive for certain bad behaviors. So between rate cases, there's a natural incentive for utilities to underinvest in their systems and then basically keep that underinvestment, those funds, and keep them as profits. But in this way, they're reporting every single year to us how much they invested in capital, what was their actual ROE, both book and rate making ROE that they earned, and then they're returning any extra to us. And that ensures that they're investing in their system in kind of a regular way, in a prudent way, and we don't go 2 or 3 years with underinvestment. It also really prevents gaming in the revenue forecast. So there are certain ways I think that a company could potentially tweak the inputs to their revenue forecast to predict earning less than they actually plan to earn. And this way, we've got a true up at the end. So we've got, I think, a more straightforward and more transparent rate case at the beginning. So I've got a couple details there about kind of how the fiscal year works, et cetera, et cetera. It's not terribly interesting, but you could ask questions about that in questions later. So maybe we can just jump on to the next slide. Great. So I wanted to really dive into the asymmetrical aspect of our earnings sharing, because I think it's got some interesting points that might be useful for states who are just starting to consider an earnings sharing. So we start with the allowed ROE, that's the red line there in the middle. And then 50 basis points above or 50 basis points below, the company basically keeps that cash. Or if they're 50 basis points below, they kind of eat the loss. So that does provide a little bit of an incentive for them to perform, and it also protects ratepayers on the downside. So where the asymmetry comes in, and it's different than Hawaii, I'm interested that Hawaii doesn't have any kind of return collections from ratepayers on the downside. But our earnings sharing, once you get into that yellow band, when you're between 50 and 125 basis points, 75% of the extra revenue is returned to customers. And then in the blue band, which it's interesting to note that that band is about 100 basis points large. So if the company under earns by between 50 and 150 basis points, they are only allowed to collect 50% from customers. So the size of the blue band is bigger, and the amount that they can collect from customers on that size is smaller. So, you know, because the company has greater access to information, because they have the opportunity to earn revenue, they've got kind of some advantages in terms of rate case data. I think that aspect of the asymmetry is important, that consumers are more protected than the company is by the earnings sharing mechanism. And then once you get into that red area, either above 125 basis points above allowed ROE or below 150, then all of the customers are either earned back or are on the hook for everything in the red. It's worth noting, though, that we have never gotten into that territory. So we've had things in place since 2006, and in all that time, at least for our gas company, they've returned money to ratepayers almost every year, and they've been just barely in that yellow band. So I think that that's kind of a healthy indicator that they're not drastically over earning, but they have been able to earn over their allowed ROE. Some other interesting features that I really would love to bring to people's attention is that the commission has the discretion to exclude items from the earnings sharing mechanism. And this has been extremely important historically. So we had a natural gas company make a major investment in an in-state transmission pipeline. Some of that was disallowed in rates through an MOU between the consumer advocate and the gas company. That disallowed expenditure was not included in the calculation of the ESM. If that hadn't been the case, we would have been way down in that red territory, and consumers would have been on the hook to basically make up the ROE for a company who had made an investment which they could not recoup. So I think that it's very important that the ESM includes enough discretion for the commission to intervene in instances where there would be a really drastic under earnings or really drastic over earnings. So although it's nice to have kind of a run-of-the-mill automatic calculation, in the event of major sort of variation in finances, you can't count on that. You've got to have some discretion built in. So let's see, I guess what else is interesting about that? Oh yeah, I just wanted to mention, while I'm still on our electric and gas utilities, the most recent electric multi-year rate plan has some other interesting features that I'll just mention, and if folks are interested, I could talk more in questions. One is a capital expenditure cap. So I think that was an important feature to get kind of related to the ESM, because if you've got a capital expenditure cap, and then you've got a kind of an ROE cap going on with the ESM, you really can create a smooth rate trajectory. It also has a climate plan that calls out particular capital investments related to hardening infrastructure in the face of climate change. So prepping for storms, you know, possibly moving some substations out of floodplains, things like that. And then the last feature that's kind of unique in Vermont is we've got a provision for innovative services. So our main electric utility can launch new services like controlled EV charging for peak shaving, for example. And they can kind of quickly launch those, run a pilot for 18 months, and then come back to us to get it as a formal tariff. So we've seen some really interesting things come out of that. Not everyone has been a success, but that's kind of how pilots go. So I just wanted to mention those features. And then I've got one more kind of slide to talk about, which is a little bit sort of a step to the right of earnings sharing, but it's an interesting feature of our performance-based regulation for our energy efficiency utility. And it came out of, like I said, we've had that utility in existence for about 20 years, and they've had performance, they've earned their kind of, you know, return on equity, if you will, on performance the entire time that they've been in existence, a percentage of it. And so the way that they earn it is we've got, like, say, 10 metrics that they're supposed to hit. It might be winter peak shaving, which is measured in kW, or it might be overall reduction in power demand in the summer, which would be a kWh. So they've got those range of metrics. And what we were finding is year after year, they would dump all their money into one area, the area where they could earn the most, almost to the exclusion of some of the other indicators. And so a few years ago, we imposed a cap on how much they could earn in any given performance category. So they start out with, let's say that metric is measured in KW, a certain number of KW, they would earn their full reward. Above that, 75%, and then there's a cap. And that has caused their investment to kind of trickle out to other areas. So it's not exactly earnings sharing, but I thought it was an important thing to bring up that was tangentially related. So great, it looks like Carrie's back on, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.